let me tell you a little bit about Lejewski, for those who don't know. He was born in Minsk in 1913, grew up there, went to study at Warsaw University, studied classics in the late 20s, early 30s, I guess, 1913, so he would have been in his 20s, sorry, and studied classics, and then he wanted to do a doctorate on logic in ancient authors, and so he went to lectures by Łukasiewicz, Lejewski, and Kotabiński, and got interested in the logic for its own sake. He did military service in 1937, and then when he was due to take his doctoral degree, the date was sometime in September 1939, and so he couldn't take it, because although he had passed the examination with Łukasiewicz as examiner, he had to say his Latin words in presence of the rector in order to actually become a doctor. So he was then taken prisoner during the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland, and spent 2 years in prisoner of war or labor camps in the Soviet Union, where presumably because he was young and strong, he survived. I mean, he had to, cut and haul trees. Eventually, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he joined the Second Polish Army Corps under Władysław Anders, great general. And he then went from the Soviet Union to Iran, to Iraq, to Palestine, to Egypt, to South Africa, to Argentina, to New York, to Scotland, which is a very long way to get from one part of Europe to another. He then joined, apparently, the Polish Parachute Brigade. There are stories, and they are not verified by means I would be prepared to swear on the Bible on, that he was parachuted into Poland behind enemy lines on more than one occasion. It depends who you spoke to. He was very, very shy and modest about what he'd done during the war, but he'd obviously been a bit of a hero. After the war, he made a living by teaching English to Polish soldiers and airmen who were in England and Scotland, but especially England. He lived in London. He met Łukasiewicz on at least one occasion when Łukasiewicz was passing through, and they got on well. He didn't even start into an academic career until he was over 40 years old. So he got his doctorate, his second doctorate in 1954 with Popper at the London School of Economics on propositional logic done in Lejewski's style. Nice little dissertation. And Łukasiewicz, in his very late years, was flown over to be an examiner again. So he then became a lecturer in Manchester and was eventually successor to Arthur Prior when Prior left Manchester in 1966. And he was professor of philosophy in Manchester from 1966 till he retired in 1980. In that time, he spent 1 year at Notre Dame University, 1960-61, at the invitation of Professor Bolesław Sobocinski, and I imagine he got on very well there. Now, in Manchester, he was relatively isolated. Two reasons. One is it was the 60s and the 70s, and people were doing the Beatles and free love and psychedelics and long hair, and he was a child of the 1930s with short hair, a suit and tie. He was also extremely quiet and polite in a rather old-fashioned, very Polish sort of way. And he just didn't go down well with the students. Now, I actually liked the way he taught, so I went to his metaphysics lectures. But I wasn't allowed to stay there for very long because my supervisor, who hated Lejewski, said, you either go to his lectures or I stop supervising you. So I had to give up. So unfortunately, I didn't go to his metaphysics lectures, but I did read something about them later. And in fact, a lot of them went into some of his papers. Then in 1984, by then I was in Salzburg, we invited him to come and give a semester teaching in Salzburg. And he gave 2 courses. One was on, what was it? One was on logical consequence, and the other was on, what is it? I can't remember now, probably metaphysics. And again, the subject matter was very like things he'd published. And he was a very interesting teacher because he didn't use any rhetorical effects at all. He just spoke very quietly. And if anything was complicated, he would have a photocopied handout and he would write formulas on the board quite slowly. And the notation he used for logical formulas was Lejewski's so-called informal notation, which means that I mean, he used Montessorian dots actually for punctuation. Now dots go back, do they go back to piano? There's certainly lots of them in Russell and Whitehead. The thing is that a dot can mean several things. It can mean conjunction, it can mean scope of quantification, and it can mean left or right brackets. So for those of you who are not, like me, familiar with using dots, you go like this when he sees. And what he used to do is he would start a lecture by talking about the subject matter in English. And then he would say, well, we could formalize this as follows. And then he'd write a formula up on the board. And then the formulas would gradually get more complicated. And then when you had a formula which was extending over several lines, he would write the quantifiers and variables in first, and then implication and disjunction. But when it came to conjunction, it was all dots. And everyone else was going like this, trying to follow him. But the interesting thing was, as far as 2 subjects were concerned, he was more or less infallible. One was what Lejewski said, or what Kotarbiński said. They were his 2 favorite teachers. The other was ancient logic. He knew an awful lot of ancient logic. Of course, one of his teachers was Łukasiewicz, who basically kick-started the modern study of the history of logic. So he had a great pedigree. Because of the mismatch between his manner and the general zeitgeist of the 1960s and 70s, he was not a popular teacher. His metaphysics class was so small it fitted in an office which was about a quarter of the size of this room. There were about 4 or 5 of us in it, and one less when I was kicked out or dragged out. Very occasionally, you could ask him a question and he would always have an answer. And the only time he was unsure of what the answer was if he was unsure of what the truth of the proposition was. So one of the questions you could pose to him in Mariology was, do all objects have proper parts? Or are there some objects which have no proper parts, which are Euclidean atoms? And his answer was, he was not sure. This, as we know, is the 2, well, there are actually 3 possibilities, but the proposition everything is made of atoms or nothing is made of atoms, these are independent of general Mariology. You can add them consistently. You can also add a hybrid axiom which says some things are not made of atoms and other things are made of atoms, but nobody, I think, does the hybrid version. And that debate still echoes today in the discussion about forms, what is called the problem of composition. So the sort of thing that Inwagen, Van Inwagen and Ted Sider and Jonathan Schaffer and lots of other people discuss as to, you know, whether there are simples or not, or whether the world is gunky. Well, I mean, they were thinking about that in Warsaw in the 1920s. So occasionally Lejewski was not sure. Mostly he was sure, and I never heard anyone defeat him in argumentation, and that included me. And I did have a go once or twice, but it was just impossible. He was an ice face. You just couldn't get any purchase on his views. Now, his views were very, very restricted. I mean, he didn't talk about ethics or existential angst or politics or even, to a great extent, epistemology, a bit of philosophy of language. And what he did was he took Lejewski's ideas and he sort of tried to develop them, or succeeded in developing them, in different directions. And some of this came through in his lecturing. So the stuff about multi-categorial ontologies, for instance. He, like Lejewski and Kotovinsky, was a monocategorial ontologist. He thought the only things there are material bodies, which I think is an absolutely crazy view these days in light of modern physics, but nevertheless. He wanted to be able to talk to people who didn't agree with him, say people who believed in abstract objects or events or something. So he developed this thing called multi-categorial ontology, where you've got one part of the language deals with concrete material things, and the other part of the language deals with, well, he called them classes, meaning sets in the modern sense. And he said, well, you can do the language like this, and then at the end of that, when you've done that, and you've been talking to your friend who believes in sets using his language, and he says to you, but you're using language about sets, do you believe in them? And you say, no. That was his view. He says, I use this language, I developed this language to be able to talk to people like you, but if you ask me whether there are things that fall under the predicates in that language, I will say, no, there aren't. There are only concrete things. So he was a monocategorial ontologist. And my friend Robert Campbell, who did manage to stay through the metaphysics lectures, said he compared it to the difference between black and white photography and color photography. So color photography is like multi-categorial ontology. You can talk about lots of different things and they come in different colors. Black and white just has black and white, and that's like monocategorial ontology. So you cannot talk about things you can talk about in color in black and white only. That's the analogy. What else can I say? First of all, he was very formal when you first knew him, very correct, very old-fashioned. You remember he'd been brought up in Poland in the 20s and 30s. But when you got to know him, he was actually very friendly, quite charming, and he enjoyed a joke. And he especially enjoyed red wine, as I discovered in Salzburg. After his lectures in Salzburg, we used to go to a local Serbian restaurant and drink Dalmatian red. It wasn't the world's best wine, but it was very cheap. And then we would then stagger back home. He also was nice to me because he knew I was working on Mariology, and he didn't agree with what I did, but he thought it was good that someone was trying to do a bit more Mariology and, you know, try and bring it to the philosophical public in a way in which he and Lejewski had not been able to do. And the other person I know that he got on well with was Józef Maria Bocheński. I know because I saw them together on a couple of occasions. One was in Manchester, and the other was the last time I saw Bocheński, which was in Grenoble. There was a meeting about Polish philosophy in Grenoble, organized by Jean-Maurice Monnoyer. And Bocheński was there. He was very old, he was walking with a stick, had a man to help him and so on. But they sat down and chatted together and joked about all the amazingly talented and eccentric people who were in Warsaw and Poland in the interwar years. And it was clear that they both respected each other. And Lejewski was someone who didn't give people respect for no reason. So he was not deferential to Bocheński, but he was respectful. He treated him as, you know, the rather great man that he was. And I think Bocheński respected Lejewski as well as a, you know, what shall we say, a notable member of the Warsaw School of Logic. And probably no person, including Sobocinski, who obviously had more of a logical following in the US, no person did more to spread Lejewskian ideas in general philosophy, abroad in particular, than Lejewski. So although he was an incredibly modest man, he never published a book. Most of his 30 or so papers are fairly technical, not all. I think he did a great job in spreading the word. I think that's probably, if anyone has any questions, I'll try and answer them.